You know, he's out there, just around the corner. Well, let's read Matthew 4, because that ties in, maybe not with his approach, but with his attitude. Look what Jesus says. Matthew 4:18. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter, his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said, "Come, follow me. I'll make you fishers of men." Now, this is the second stage in calling. They'd already introduced each other over in John chapter 1, so they knew who he was. So when he comes, he's not a total stranger. They know about him. And he says the purpose is, what? You're going to be a fisher for men. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee, his brother John. They're in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. And Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father, and they followed Jesus. I did a little exercise this week, and it wasn't a fun one. In fact, I need to apologize to God and to you, because I kind of lost this heart. I went back and looked at my sermons for the first 10 years I was here, and then the second 10, the third, and I noticed a trend I didn't like. I preached a lot of sermons on evangelism and salvation the first 10 years I was here. Not as many the second 10 years, and not many at all the third 10 years. And it was a sobering week, because I apologize to God for that. Apologize to you for that. 30 years ago, I read this little story, and not long ago, Glenn picked up on it. But I remember reading this, and I've read it several times over the years, and I hope Casas didn't ever get there. Didn't realize things sometimes drift. May I read it again? First time it was read at Casas 30 years ago. On a dangerous seacoast, where shipwrecks often occurred, there was a crude life-saving station. The building was just a hut, and they only had one boat. But the few devoted members kept a constant watch over the sea. With no thought for themselves, they went out day and night, tirelessly searching for the lost. Many lives were saved by this little life-saving station. It became famous. And some of the ones who were saved, and various others in the surrounding areas, wanted to become associated with the work, so they gave of their time and money and effort for the support of the station. New boats were bought, new crews were trained, and the little station grew. Some of the members of the life-saving station were unhappy because it was such a crude little station, so poorly equipped, and they felt that a more comfortable place ought to be provided for those who were saved from the sea. So they replaced the emergency cots and the beds and put a better furniture in the enlarged building. Now the life-saving station became a popular gathering place for its members, and they decorated it beautifully and exquisitely and began to use it something like a club. Fewer members were now interested in going to sea on life-saving missions, so they hired boat crews to do the work. A life-saving motif still prevailed in the club's decoration, and there was even a liturgical lifeboat in the room where they held their initiations. About this time, a large ship wrecked off the coast, and the hired crews brought in loads of cold, wet, half-drowned people. They were dirty and sick, and some had black skin, and some had yellow skin. The beautiful men's club was considerably messed up, so the Building and Grounds Committee decided to build a shower house outside the walls of the club, where the victims of the wreck could be cleaned up before being brought inside. At the next meeting, there was a split in the club membership. Most of the men and women wanted to stop the club's life-saving activities as being a hindrance and not normal, and a hindrance to the normal social life of the club. Some members, on the other hand, insisted that life-saving was still their primary purpose, and they pointed out, well, we're still called the Life-Saving Club. But they were voted down and told that if they wanted to save the lives of the various people who were struggling and shipwrecked in those waters, they could start their own life-saving station a bit down the coast. So they did. As the years went by, the new station experienced the same changes as the old station. It even evolved into a club, and another life-saving station was founded. history continued to repeat itself. And if you visit that coast today, you'll find a number of exquisite clubs along the shore. Shipwrecks are frequent in those waters, and most of the people drowned. You know, I slipped away from this a bit, and 30 years ago thought, I don't want this to happen, but in some ways it's kind of happened. And one of our hearts is to kind of return to the, what did Jesus say? I call you to be what? Fishers of men. And that's what we're here for. Well, that's what we're supposed to be here for. You see, when we enter into the life of Christ, a normal Christian life is a life involved in fishing for men and women to save the ones Jesus called the lost with a capital L. I mean, you think about it. You go to a Marine boot camp, you come out a Marine. You go to med school, you come out a doctor or a nurse. You go to Embry-Riddle Flight School, you can become an airplane pilot. You go to Juilliard Conservative, and you can emerge as a musician. You go to the School of Jesus Christ, and you emerge a fisher of men. That's what he said. I'm going to make you a fisher of men. I want to put a little spiritual growth chart on the screen. We've talked about this a lot. It's no surprise. You and I go through the door of salvation. We start growing as spiritual infants, spiritual children. And along the way, God uses the cross to process us, to continue to mature us, and one day, hopefully, we've grown to be spiritual mothers, spiritual fathers. But that's not where it starts. I want to put another chart on the screen. We've talked about the scale from -10 to +10. With 0 plus, you're growing up in Christ, and -10 to 0, you're coming to Christ. And you become a Christian at 0. That's where the transition is made. And of course, out at -10, you're really far from Christ. At -5, you're getting closer, but still a long way away. Why is this important? Because, Glenn says that in the last 25 years, our culture has moved from a -3 to a -7. We're a long way from where we were. I was talking to a fireman, a fire lieutenant here recently, whose marriage was falling apart. And we got in touch, so I took him down to Starbucks. I've learned that from Glenn. So I went to Starbucks, and we're sitting there talking about his marriage, about his life, and everything's falling apart. And it was his fault, hands down. He was able to discern there's not another man involved. Don't believe that's true. He messed up really bad. He didn't understand what he was doing or why. So I sat down and began to explain to him, and finally it was kind of funny. He said to me, "How do you know so much about women?" And I said, "Well, I live with 3, and one of them's my dog. But then I said, no, the truth is, everything I've shared with you has come out of the Bible. This is not hard. I haven't shared anything with you that doesn't come out of the Bible. It explains how to understand people and why they do what they do." And he was seeing some of the things he had done and how they came across, and he had really, really messed it up. And now he's crying. He was hurting really badly. So we chatted about his upcoming divorce, finalized in a couple, 3 weeks to come, how to handle that. He was having a hard time. He couldn't even go back to his own home. She gave him the house, but he couldn't go back there because it was so lonely. So he was sleeping at his mother's house. This is a 40-year-old fireman, tough guy, just crying there in Starbucks. I said, "Well, let me tell you how to get through this. We're going to go to Philippians chapter 4. I said, "Here's some of my favorite stuff. Go to Philippians 4, and God says, think about things that are true and honest and pure, and you get control of your thinking. And, another thing you might want to do is go to, also in Philippians 4, learn to be content. I can do all things through Christ who pours in the power." And he says to me, "Boy, that's really good stuff. What's Philippians?" So I pull out my Bible. Show him right there what Philippians is and where those verses are right in the Bible. This is good. So do you have a Bible? No? Well, okay, let's get one. Now, you're going to want to read Matthew and John because they're about Jesus. What are Matthew and John? He didn't know what Matthew and John were. Is that New Testament or Old Testament? Well, it's part of the New Testament. Now, you also want to learn about God and people, so I want you to read Psalms and Proverbs. Just give him some basic stuff, and he goes, "Psalms and Proverbs, is that New Testament?" I said, "No, those are books. They fit under the Old Testament." Totally, totally, totally oblivious to spiritual things in Christianity. What was he, -5, -6? That's our culture today. So understanding that, let's go back to our spiritual growth chart. And what you and I discover as we work through this is that no matter what stage we're on, we're still fishers of men and women. Whether we're children or young men or fathers. Only spiritual fathers and mothers are better at it, got more experience. And young men and women are better than children, but you can become an evangelist no matter what stage you are in. For example, spiritual infant, spiritual child, woman at the well. I'll give you some living water. Give me some living water. She becomes a Christian. She runs into town and leads a whole city to Jesus. And she's only been a Christian 5 minutes. That's not bad for a little spiritual child. How about a spiritual young man? How about Peter? You know, I mentioned it wasn't the first call there in Matthew 4. There were 4 calls. He met Jesus in John 1. He was called to follow him in Matthew 4. And then a little bit later, he became an apostle. And Jesus sent him out with the 72 to preach. And that's a spiritual young man. He's learned with Christ. He's gone along. Now it's time to evangelize as a spiritual young man. And then after the resurrection, he becomes a spiritual father. And he's still a fisherman. God never took that away. But he also adds the addition of he's a shepherd. He's got to take care of these sheep. That's what mothers and fathers do. And so at any stage, fishing for men and women is just part of the normal Christian life. You know, it becomes real powerful as we become spiritual mothers and fathers because we so much have the life of Christ. It's really attractive to people. It's really attractive. That's why you want to go to be a spiritual mother and father. I remember the story of a little boy who had gone to Sunday school, and when he came back, his mom asked him, well, what was your teacher's name? He said, well, I don't remember her name, but she must have been Jesus' grandmother because she talked about him all the time. Isn't that sweet? I just want to tell. Now let me show you what happens in this cycle. Here's where we're heading. Let me read you in Mark chapter 4, verse 28 and 29. Here's where it goes. All by itself. Notice 3 stages here. All by itself, the soil produces grain. First the stalk, then the head, then the full kernel in the head. See, that's a spiritual growth verse. A little stalk, become an immature head of wheat, and then all of a sudden there's a mature head of wheat. And I used to think, well, that's the height of spiritual maturity. You grow and you're up there in the wheat, you know, with all the other ripe wheat, and you go to church and you all fellowship together. And then I began to realize the chart goes up, but then the chart goes straight down. As soon as the grain is ripe, he what? Puts the sickle to it because the harvest has come. He'll cut it off. And what happens to the cut off grain? Well, Jesus says, John chapter 12, 24 and 25, I tell you the truth, and he held this little seed in his hand. He says to the disciples, except this little grain of wheat fall on the ground and die, it's really kind of worthless. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. And there's the full cycle. I start out as a minus, 2, 5, 10. I come to Christ, I start growing, I become a fisherman, and by the time I'm a spiritual mother and father, I don't get to sit up here in church with all the other Christians and have big time. Well, there's that. But I'm supposed to go down there to the world and die. So what? Produce much fruit. There's a new spiritual growth book out. It's called The Shack. Many of you have read it, commented upon it. You kind of wonder about it at first, but boy, where it leads you is a beautiful thing. But that's not my favorite spiritual growth book. My all-time favorite still is Hannah Hurnard's Hinds Feet on High Places. Many of you have read this book. It's a story of a little girl named Much Afraid who wants to go. Well, she's in the Valley of Humiliation. It's an allegory. She's got a cousin named Craven Fear. She comes from the family of the Fearings, and she's afraid. And it's a story of how the shepherd, Jesus, gives her 2 companions, suffering and sorrow. It's her guides to lead her up to the high places. And she wants to go there because she's heard in the high places, Jesus takes her twisted mouth and makes it straight. He takes these crippled legs and he makes them strong. And so you read the whole book, and it's a cool book of all the journeys up to the spiritual mountaintops. And she gets up there, and she's finally made it to the heights. And God changes her name from Much Afraid to Grace and Glory. Oh, shucks. What's her name? I forgot. Oh, well, that's okay. She really matured greatly. We'll just put it that way. And her companions are turned into grace and glory. And there's this scene at the end of the book when she's looking over the mountaintop down in the Valley of Humiliation, and all of her family's down there. And she's made the journey, but they're still craving fear and misery and the fearings. And she looks down there and she sees them, and all of a sudden she starts crying. And one of her helpers comes up and says, "What you crying for?" And she says, "Well, look at all my neighbors and my friends and my family down there. Who's going to tell them?" And immediately the shepherd appears and says, "Well, you are. The reason I brought you up here, stock, head, mature head, is what? I'm going to cut you off now. I'm going to send you back down there. You're the one best qualified to go back and lead your family to Christ." It's a beautiful book. And so the second book is called Mountains of Spices. And that's the story of her journey down to help lead her family to Christ. See, you grow to maturity, and then you go down powerfully equipped as an evangelist. That's a good question to ask. Are you sequestered in a spiritual bubble? That's a fair question to ask. Do you have any spiritual children? That's an interesting question to ask. Have you led anybody to Christ? That's a fair question to ask, because the purpose of being a Christian is to lead people to Christ, to be a fisherman. Let me kind of put this in really simple terms. Glenn's talked to us about what he calls a prophetic church. I'll put the prophetic church over here. And he also talked about what's called the fortress church, and I'll put one of those over here. Then he talks about the kingdom church. We'll do that one in the middle. Remember, he talked about what the prophetic church does. It preaches hard what? Stop behaving the way you're behaving. It's what is designed to change the world by politics. Well, it's political season. So let's think about this. Here's the prophetic church going to get in there and legislate and change the world by politics. But who is that really? Well, Jesus didn't do that. He never touched that. And you got over here the fortress church, which, builds a big wall because we're afraid of the world. And then, of course, you got the kingdom church here in the middle, which is Glenn talks about going out as salt and light. It gets out there in the world. And what's the difference? The prophetic church, our person, tries to change the world through politics. They're trying to change what? They're legislating what? Behavior. Now, Jesus did talk about that. What are these folks called? Pharisees. You do not change people by trying to change their behavior. That's what the Pharisees did. He never did that. But he also didn't hide in the fortress. A lot of churches, a lot of Christians, they're afraid of the world out there, so they hide back here in this big fortress. Casas kind of has been that. But no more. Want to be a kingdom church. What did Jesus do? He changed hearts. And you know what I think? Our culture's gone -3 to -7. And here's why I think why. Because somehow we forgot the fact that the main job is to fish for men and change hearts. And if we'd spent all the time trying to change hearts that we've spent hiding from the world and being in politics, we might really have made a powerful difference in our country. Because he called us to change hearts. That's by being fishers of men and women. That's how significant and important this is. So you've heard Jack talk about invest, invite. Invest in your friends. Invite them to come. It's not hard. And Casas will stay a whole lot the same. But the whole attitude, it's time to go back to those earlier years here and get outside the walls of this church. Well, Paul tells us, be ready to share the gospel. So inside your handout, I've given you three things that you might want to consider, and there's other ways to get at this, but just some things you might want to consider when the opportunity presents itself. Number one, remember that the message of Christ is good news. Sourpusses don't tend to lead people to Christ. It's not very attractive. And if you experience the good news, you want to share the good news, it's changing your life, and a lot of you have your lives being changed. Now let's invest and invite. When I first became a Christian, I was so excited. I ran down to my second grade teacher with my Bible and said, do you mind if I carry my Bible to class? She kind of grinned. That's fine. And then here's what I said. Brand new Christian. I said to her, I've read from the beginning of the Bible all the way to Psalms this last weekend. She looked at me and she said, oh, really? And, I kind of started my Christian life with a lie, because you don't become perfect, when you become a Christian. But I sure was excited, see. And I had to go back and confess that to God when I understood why she kind of looked at me like she thought I was crazy, okay. But I surely was excited. And I was a brand new Christian. It was good news. Told my friend Billy Guy. He didn't become a Christian, but my friend Jim Tosh did. We both got baptized on the same night. And when he was 17, he ran his pickup truck, turned it over on a dirt road, and killed himself. But, Jim's in heaven. I was so excited. Remember that as you're leading someone to Christ, that the Christian life is so fantastic, it needs a new birth. Because the physical birth just isn't enough. That's why Jesus says to Nicodemus, you got to be born again. So we're talking about a tremendous change. And what is it? Just being real simple and logical. What is it that keeps us from experiencing the living water? What is it that keeps us experiencing the bread of life? It's sin. Sin messes all that up. That's the book of Romans. We've all sinned. That's what moves us to, and I'm being real simple here, Jesus Christ died on the cross for our sins. He forgives them. And then you've got to make to that personal move. Would you like to receive Christ? It's always a personal decision. And when that happens, life is transformed. This is not hard, especially when it's happened to you. Now, I gave this kind of as a list, okay, rational little list. But you've got to think of this more in terms of an experience. Because you can read a people a list, not get their heart, but you share your experience. This is an experiential thing. I was driving to a church this morning, listening to KFLT, and the disc jockey started talking about Stephen Curtis Chapman, who's a very famous Christian singer. His daughter was killed in a terrible wreck a few months ago. And so he's musing about this, and he's talking about, well, my buddy and I discussed whether or not Stephen Curtis Chapman would continue his touring or whether he'd stop and take a break. And to my surprise, he kept on touring. I guess it's because, God's teaching him some things, and God's encouraging him with it. This guy goes on and on about what God was telling him, and I'm just getting more unimpressed the more he goes. Thinking, he has no idea. He doesn't know until all of a sudden the guy says, when I was diagnosed with MS a year and a half ago, wow. And all of a sudden, everything he'd said before just got validated. He knew it. See, if all you got is things to say, it's not going to communicate well. But when you're sharing your very life, that's got power. So let's just say a word now. Where are you going to fish? Where are you going to fish? In a culture where it's -5s and -7s. And I think this is not hard. Where am I going to go fishing? Well, let me give you a few thoughts of where fishing might be most effective. Woman at the well. What's she feeling? Rejected. What's he say to her? Living water? See, what was he doing to the rejected woman? He was accepting her. There are a lot of rejected people. And she came to Christ because he was willing to accept her. Think about the disciples. Raging storm. Is this a struggle? Sure it was. They were struggling to survive. And here comes Jesus, and what does he give them? Support. He's supporting the struggling. And they were terribly impressed by who he was. Or think about Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus when everybody's hurting, and so what does he do? He weeps with them, and he comforts them. And lo and behold, after comforting the hurting there, John tells us that a whole town of Jewish folk came to know Christ. Where did he fish? Well, just real simple in a few areas. He fished where the people were rejected, where they were struggling. He fished where the people were hurting. So what do? It's not hard. You fish by accepting rejected people, by supporting the struggling people, by comforting the hurting people. Oh, remember my fireman friend? Was he rejected? The day she walked out the door, you just sort of heard him talk about it. The rejection. Some of you have gone through that. It was an awful time. Was he struggling? Was he struggling? We're sitting there in Starbucks and he's weeping. How am I going to handle this? What's going to go? I can't even go home And it's all my fault, and most all of it was. Was he hurting? Yeah. So I said to him, "Hey, are you a Christian?" And he said, "Nope, I'm a Catholic." This is not knocking Catholics, because he hadn't been in the Catholic Church since he was about 4 years old, okay? But he still considered it his church. "You a Christian?" "No." "Catholic." "Let me talk to you about Christ." So he goes from about a -6 to a 0 in about an hour and a half. See, sometimes they can make that move really quickly. Sometimes it takes a little longer. But that's where you fish. The world's full of hurting people. Come alongside. Minister to them. They're fishing. That's where the fish are. So, Anthony Campolo tells of a minister friend of his. She was a pastor in the Presbyterian church who loved to go at Christmas time to Nordstrom's there in Bel Air, California, because she loved the Christmas decorations and the music to the store, and she just liked the ambiance. So she'd walk through the store at Christmas. Well, she'd made it to the top floor where the most expensive thousands of dollars dresses were, and she's just kind of enjoying the moment as she walks around. Elevator opens, and out steps a bag lady. And I don't want to categorize this woman or put her in some kind of box, except maybe that term kind of gives the feeling of what she was going through. She stands there with a total disheveled hair. Her clothes are a wreck. Her stockings are rolled down to her ankles. Got this old dirty gym bag. And Campolo's minister friend said, "I thought the security would be there pretty quickly," but the security didn't come. Instead, one of the stately salesmen walked over to her, and I decided I'd kind of watch. Well, the stately saleswoman walks over to her and says, "May I help you?" And the bag lady says, "I want to buy a dress." "What kind of dress?" "Party dress." "Well, you've come to the right place. We have the loveliest party dresses." And for the next 15, 20 minutes, she took the lady over to the mirror, and she looked at her complexion and got her eyes, and she pulled different colors together, and they went and selected several party dresses. They settled on 3. They went together into the dressing room, and she tried on all 3 dresses. And after trying on all 3 and looking at all 3, the lady says to the sales lady, "Well, I've decided not to buy a party dress today." And the saleswoman said, "Oh, well, that's quite all right. Here," she said, "let me give you my card. And if you're ever in Nordstrom's again, you be sure and ask for me. I'd be pleased to wait on you again." Now I think that's what Jesus would do if he were a salesman at Nordstrom's. I came to seek and save the lost. Well, let's pray. In fact, while our heads are bowed and eyes are closed, you might just for a moment just do what I did this week. Look back over the last several years of my life and realized in some ways I'd become more of a club than a life-saving station. And I confess that to God. I want to really turn that around. And maybe in your life you'd have to say the same thing. Okay, slipped away a bit, kind of drifted a bit. I want to say, "God, I'm really sorry. I'm not even sure how to do all this, but would you just open the doors, and I know enough." So might you want to just say to God you're available? Maybe refocus your heart a little bit too, just like I did. And Father, as we come before you with a few of those thoughts, I pray for our church and the leadership. While so much here stays the same, there's an underflowing attitude of reaching this lost world for Jesus like we've never had before. Make it go deep. want to remind you that Bible classes start for all of us. You want to make your way to your adult Bible fellowship. You know what? You may not be a Christian. And in the last service, one of the folks here who wasn't a Christian just walked over to the prayer ministry room and received Christ. And you may want to become a Christian this morning. So let me encourage you to do that. Got some special needs. Our pastors are there. And our adult Bible fellowship folks are on the plaza. If you don't know where to go, they'd be glad to help you. Okay, shall we stand together? And may God bless us all this week. We're dismissed till we gather again next Sunday. Thank you.